네, 안녕하십니까. 잠시 후 2023 제17회 세계
Good morning. We'll begin the session for shipping and port shortly. We're providing simultaneous translation, and you can get the receivers from the entrance of the hall, or some receivers are on the table. Korean is channel 3, and English channel 4. Japanese is channel 5. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the marine transport session of the 17th World Ocean Forum 2023 will begin shortly. All the presentations and talks are simultaneously translated. You may use the interpretation receiver on your table, and if you don't have one, you can get one at the entrance of this hall. Korean is channel 3, and English is channel 4, and Japanese is channel 5. We'll see you very shortly. Thank you very much. 네, 안녕하십니까. 제17회
Good morning. Welcome to the shipping and port session of the 17th World Ocean Forum. My name is Park Se-won. In this era, we're seeing many changes related to decarbonization when it comes to shipping and digitalization. Against this backdrop, we are going to look at digitalization and decarbonization linked with shipping strategies. So today we're going to look at the present and future of shipping and port. We have presenters from the US, the UK, and Japan on and offline. So we will have many different and global perspectives. Please welcome the chair of the session, Professor Kim In-hyun of Korea University School of Law. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
예, 여러분 반갑습니다.
Good morning. This is the session for shipping and port, and I'd like to extend my warm welcome to all the participants. I'm the chair of the session from the School of Law, Korea University. My name is Kim In-hyun. I'm also serving as an advisor to the Minister of Oceans and Fisheries of Korea. Today, the session is themed Shipping and Port, the Present and Future Directions. In order to discuss this topic, we have 4 presenters. As 2D, decarbonization and digitalization have become a big buzzword, we have this world-renowned presenters and scholars. We have Professor Tristan Smith and Commissioner Sam Cho. And also we have President Kim Seung-nam, who will be talking about smart ports. So when it comes to exports and imports, we have comprehensive logistics contracts, and for global SC, we should be adaptable to catch up with the changes around the world. So in this respect, we also have Mr. Akiyama Masami of Nippon Express, Korea. So with these 4 distinguished presentations, we have a panel discussion. Professor Woo Soo-han and Professor Woo Soo-han will be leading a panel discussion. We already distributed booklets. Excuse me, we do not provide proceedings for the forum. So what we do is the chair, which is myself, tries to give summaries of the presentations in 3 or 4 sentences so you can get key takeaways from the presentations. Then why don't we welcome the first presenter? He's from London. I believe that it's 2 a.m. Well, UCL, this is a top 2 or top 3 prestigious college in the UK. Please welcome Professor Tristan Smith. 3rd and 4th GG studies of the IMO is something he was involved in, and he's responsible for this net zero efforts as well. Please welcome Professor Tristan Smith.
Professor Smith?
예, 반갑습니다. 예.
Hello, it's Korea. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Annyeonghaseyo. Thank you for the opportunity to share some material with you. And it is indeed 2 o'clock in the morning, but it's a real pleasure to be here and talking in this session. So I'm going to focus on the questions around decarbonisation of the shipping industry and share a few slides on the subject, particularly in the context of international negotiations and the developments from this year. But first, let me just provide some of the background for where this material is coming from. I have been operating a research group focused on decarbonising shipping for about 14 years. And I work in collaboration with a private company under the branding UMass. So I'm also director of UMass, which provides advice and advisory. And some of our work is in reports that we write collaboratively with different organizations listed here. So we historically very much focused on the techno-economics of shipping's decarbonisation. What is the combination of technologies that can achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions in line with those rates of reduction that society expects in the least cost way? How do we decarbonize and maintain global trade as much as possible? And this slide presents some of those different reports that I've tried to use in combination to produce this set of slides. Historically, quite a lot of the work that has contributed towards shipping's decarbonisation comes from national strategies. So I've got some examples here of work that is going on in the UK for about 4 or 5 years now. The UK developed its own Clean Maritime Plan in 2019 and has been pursuing various different efforts since 2019 to identify the steps that will need to be taken to decarbonise the UK domestic fleet and the investments needed to help decarbonise the operations of shipping, including imports in the different vessel types and on the interfaces between domestic and international shipping. And those commitments have developed into some funding, some public funding, as well as some developments in terms of policies and regulation. But it's really the steps that occurred this year in the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, Marine Environment Protection Committee, MEPC, that I want to focus a lot of today's slides on. This graph shows the range of projections for the CO2 emissions from shipping over the period from now, approximately 2020 out to 2050. And those projections previous to the agreements at MEPC 80, were relatively negative. They're this black band of emissions here, the blue emissions that occur under business as usual policy scenarios. And those business as usual policy scenarios would expect shipping to have growing emissions over the next 3 decades because trade is growing. And whilst there are policies to improve energy efficiency, those policies don't reduce emissions sufficiently to offset the growth that comes from the growth in trade and the growth in demand for shipping. But in July this year, we agreed a new set of ambitions or targets, which amount to a 20% reduction, striving for 30% reduction in 2030. That's represented in the purple dots here. And then in 2040, a 70% absolute emission reduction, striving for 80% absolute emission reduction. That's the purple dots down here. So we end up with a new pathway characterizing the IMO's intent for the absolute pathway, the absolute emissions pathway of international shipping over the next 3 decades. And that pathway is now very close to the pathways that characterize a 1.5 degree aligned transition. So the green line here is something that comes from the IPCC's assessment reports that give recommendations for the amount of absolute greenhouse gas emissions that need to be on the pathway that limits our temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. But those absolute emissions aren't necessarily what needs to happen at the individual ship level. And on this graph here, I'm comparing that IMO announcement, the at least 20% and the striving for 30% targets in blue, with another piece of pathway advice, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, 1.5 aligned pathway that we worked on previous to the IMO's agreement. And these are all characterized not in terms of absolute emission reduction for the sector as a whole, but in terms of the greenhouse gas intensity reductions that the average ship will need to do. And the reason why these numbers are different is because of that statement made previously that growth in trade and growth in demand for shipping mean that we can expect, if nothing else changes, a growth in shipping emissions over the next 3 decades. And it's against that backdrop of growth in trade that the average ship will need to make a much greater greenhouse gas intensity reduction in percentage terms than the absolute emissions target. So to hit that 20 striving for 30% absolute emission reduction, the average ship will need to reduce between 55 and 61% in its greenhouse gas intensity by 2030 on a 2008 baseline. The average ship will need to do somewhere around 90%, so between 86 and 91% greenhouse gas intensity reductions by 2040 to hit the 70 striving for 80%. So these levels of greenhouse gas intensity reductions are extremely high compared to the current or the historic emissions, and therefore they require some really fundamental questions of the technologies and the operational practices that the fleet will need to use. The graph here is focused on what might happen in 2030, and we've imagined 4 different scenarios for the different types of fuel mix that we will have by 2030. This is only 7 years away, and so the question is really what can we expect realistically in that timescale to change in the fuel mix? And in most cases, the changes we think that will happen are relatively small. So in scenario 1, we only have 5% of the fuel mix moving to RFNBO. That stands for renewable fuel of non-biological origin. So hydrogen-derived fuels like ammonia and hydrogen-derived methanol would be an example of an RFNBO. The orange bar corresponds to liquid natural gas, which is already in use in some ships at the moment, and the blue bar corresponds to biofuel. So we anticipate in each of these scenarios some different combination of those fuels, because we don't know for sure how they will vary by the time we get to 2030. But having established those fuel scenarios, we then say, well, what would the efficiency improvement need to be in order to achieve those levels of carbon intensity reduction or greenhouse gas intensity reduction in line with the IMO's new targets? And actually, relatively independently of the fuel mix, the efficiency improvement needs to be around 42 to 48% on the 2008 baseline for the 20% reduction target, or 50 to 55% for the 30% reduction target. So we're talking about reductions in magnitude of the energy efficiency or improvements in energy efficiency of around 50%, regardless of the fuel mix. And so an important message we can take here is energy efficiency, especially this decade, is going to be very important for improving the fleet, and large increases are going to be required of existing ships as well as the new build ships that are coming into the fleet to achieve those overall averages. But the fuel mix is probably the most important characteristic when we think about the longer term, beyond 2030. And the graph here is taken from work that we did in the lead up to the IMO's adoption of its revised strategy in a paper to MEPC 79, the meeting about 12 months ago, where we analysed some of the different greenhouse gas emissions pathways that the IMO might consider for its ambitions, and looked at the fuel mix that was needed in order to achieve those pathways. And what you can see here is a graph showing time on the x-axis and energy on the y-axis, energy use, the input energy to the global fleet of international ships on the y-axis. And each of the colours represents a different fuel. So the conventional fuels, low sulfur fuel oil and marine diesel oil, are blue and orange. They're the colours on the left-hand side here, and they are the main constituents of the energy mix in the fleet today. Whereas we have new fuels, so LNG emerging, growing, but then contracting again over the 2030s, and ammonia, this contribution from the colour red here, which emerges gradually during the later part of this decade, but then grows very rapidly over the 2030s, so that it's by far the dominant fuel by the time we get to the 2040s. Now, there are many other fuels, as you can see in the legend, that are represented within this fuel mix. We include methanol, synthetic methanol made from direct air capture, biofuels like bio-MDO and biofuel oils and biogas and biomethanol, and electricity used in shore power. So all of these are considered as options, but the way that we've set this up is to ask, given those options, which set of fuels will provide the least cost achievement of the greenhouse gas reduction targets. And in most scenarios that we model, it isn't those other fuels that have a dominant role. It's consistently ammonia, which is the least cost pathway for the deep greenhouse gas reductions. Now that's an interesting challenge for the sector technologically, and we wanted to look deeper into that. And this is a graph to show what the impact might need to be in new building activity, but also in retrofitting and scrappage. And this is a really important graph for shipbuilding countries like Korea, where the implications of that significant technology shift are not just in how we build new ships, but also, as you can see here, in the 2030s, as the transition is getting well underway, there's going to be a large demand for retrofitting existing vessels to the new fuel. So these green bars here show that there is likely to be, in order to achieve that scenario, thousands of ships a year which will need engine and fuel storage and fuel system retrofitting. In this scenario to ammonia, but it could be to any equivalent hydrogen-derived fuel that is providing the deep greenhouse gas emission reductions at scale that were needed for the ambitions. One of the questions that we often get asked is, what's the credibility of the demand for fuels being satisfied by supply? So how quickly could supply and production of new fuel grow in order to meet the decarbonisation of shipping, and are those very rapid growths of ammonia, which will need to be low carbon ammonia, credible in practice. And so we have done some analysis on that, which is included in this plot here, that shows the current production globally today of about 4 exajoules of ammonia. That's equivalent to about 180, 200 million tons of ammonia that we use today, but all of that is grey ammonia. So it's all produced using fossil fuels with CO2 released into the atmosphere. And we record some of the projects that have already been announced that we can expect to be coming online in the future, and those are represented here by the green bar. The red dotted lines here are the growth in demand for ammonia as marine fuel use moves to that molecule. And the colours that you can see here represent limits on the growth rate that we've observed historically. So we looked back to the 1940s all the way through to this current decade at the rates of production growth in ammonia. And there were periods historically when ammonia production grew at about 10% per annum. So what we're showing is that the growth rate required in order to meet the decarbonisation will need very rapid growth. It will need compound annual growth rates of the order of 10% per annum. But those are growth rates which are not inconsistent with what we've seen historically. And we look to the sector, we've spent time with the fuel producers. You can see here a list of organisations that signed up to a commitment to supply some of the fuels that shipping will need, even in the 2030s window, and launched at COP27 last year with the climate champions, a commitment called Green Hydrogen and Green Shipping. Now, one of the consequences of this is that we can expect transport costs to increase. The demand and use of new fuels is the use of an energy commodity that is more expensive, and that requires us to anticipate that increase in transport cost and consider how it will need to be included and incorporated in the way we make policy. So this is analysis we've done to show the consequence of that fuel mix and transition within the fleet to the overall costs. And we see costs nearly doubling related to energy costs. So these are the costs associated with fuels and machinery on board ships. The total cost of shipping is obviously much higher than this. It includes other cost components to do with the vessels themselves and the operation of the vessels, the port fees. So this is just the energy related cost, and we see it approximately doubling before it then reduces, because many of these cost components are going to undertake rapid cost reductions over the period of time that we see ahead of us. Relative to some of the spikes that we have historically, this is some of the higher costs that were experienced in 2022 due to the higher oil and gas prices. These are not necessarily very large increases. But that's going to be important for the policy landscape. And here I've just got one of the ways in which policy will need to be designed. The fuel standard, which is under development at the moment at the IMO, we think will need to have a magnitude in mandating lower greenhouse gas intensity fuels with a reduction of around 10 to 20% in 2030 and a reduction of 75 to 85% in 2040. But that's not the only policy stimulus that we have to the transition. We can also expect to see policy stimulus in the form of a carbon price and the use of revenues reinvested into the sector. I just want to show a couple of slides here on how that might be experienced within individual companies. So that was very much the high level policy narrative, but we're working already with companies that are trying to manage their climate risk by signing up to the Science Based Targets Initiative or equivalent. And you can see here what the new build ordering will need to be for a company that wants to commit to those, how they can achieve some very steep greenhouse gas emissions reduction in the portfolio of ships that they operate. So the requirement would be for a company that operates very new ships, so is ordering new builds and selling them at the age of 7, they would need to start ordering zero emission ships in 2025 as about 10% of the new builds they order. But by 2032, every ship that they order would have to be a zero emission capable ship. So a dual fuel or equivalent vessel capable of using hydrogen derived fuels. And that contrasts with a company that has an older fleet. So a company that might have ships for around 14 years would need to have both a combination of new building ordering, but also thinking about how it would retrofit their vessels as the new new vessels come into the global fleet. This plot down here shows the way that a company or a financier's portfolio might evolve over the next decade, and combining both existing technology assets, the grey shape here, new build zero emission ships, but also some retrofitting, the orange space here, particularly in the early 30s, consistent with what we showed earlier about the need for some retrofitting within the global fleet. So finally, there is an opportunity here for early adopters, as well as those companies that will be part of the mass market transition. But it's very clear from our work that the way that those early adopters, especially in the next 3 years, so this is the time period 2024 to 27, will need to close the total cost of operation gap between using a near zero or a zero greenhouse gas emission fuel and an incumbent fuel. And they'll need to find both the least cost opportunities for those early uses, look to national governments for grants and support, look to other national and regional policies, such as the EU's regulation or the US Inflation Reduction Act for subsidies or other types of incentive for using fuels, and look to customers who are willing to pay. And the launch of the ZEMBA, the Zero Emission Maritime Buyers Alliance, which is tendering 600,000 TEUs worth of 90% or lower greenhouse gas intensity reduction fuel use, is a good example of that. But as we move to the later part of this decade in the early 30s, there'll be many more ways in which that gap of total cost of operation can be closed. And that building these into strategies is going to be difficult, but important for companies that want to be at the forefront of the transition. So to conclude, MEPC 80, the meeting that happened in July this year, represented a quantum leap of ambition by the regulator, and it signals a rapid IMO-led fuel transition, particularly through the 2030s. Hydrogen-derived fuels that are scalable and achieve some of the very deep greenhouse gas emissions intensity reductions are going to be critical. Our analysis is consistently showing ammonia is the least cost fuel for that transition, and it will need to scale fast, but not in an unprecedented way, not in a way which is exceptional relative to history. The fleet transition looks likely to occur through new building, but also through large volumes of retrofit. This is something that's going to need both approaches for the transition, and policy will need to be and is being reinforced with voluntary actions as stakeholders, ship owners, financiers, insurers, charterers all manage their climate and transition risk. Finally, early adopters in the transition have a number of levers, a number of ways in which they can make a business case early and enable the use of long-run solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Tristan Smith. Despite early hours, you gave us a wonderful presentation, and in conclusion, you summed up your presentation in 5 points. MEPC 80 represented a quantum leap for net zero, and going forward, ammonia will be a very dominant dual energy source, with its share growing very rapidly after 2030. And for those in the shipping industry, you may have to build new ships, and also you may have to retrofit existing ships. I think these were the 3 main points of the presentation.